Welcome to the Eclectic Topics Podcast. My name is Jeffrey Taylor, your host, and today we'll be discussing the topics of Scotland, America, freedom, the Stone of Destiny, and the prophet Jeremiah. But first, we're going to start out with a document called the Declaration of Arbroath. The Declaration of Arbroath was summarized by one historian as one of the masterpieces of political rhetoric of all time. In the year 1320 AD, a letter to the Pope was written that defined and outlined the character of a people and their nation. It was written in the aftermath of the difficult wars of independence against England, which came to a head in 1314 with the Scottish victory at the Battle of Bannockburn. It has become synonymous with the terms freedom and civil liberty. It had quite an impact in its day and is also believed to have had an influence on Thomas Jefferson and the American Declaration of Independence some 450 years later. The letter, also known as the Letter from the Barons of Scotland to Pope John XXII, was designed to influence the papacy in favor of the Scottish King Robert the Bruce, who had been bravely fighting against the English King Edward I and his aggressive moves towards Scotland for some time. Bruce, known as Robert I, had been excommunicated by the church primarily due to his having murdered a competitor in the past with some accomplices, something that is admittedly abhorrent, but actually was not as rare in medieval times as we may think today. So understandably, the church took action against Bruce through excommunication. Arbroath Abbey, in the northeast of Scotland, was founded by William I in 1178 and dedicated to St. Thomas Becket. It has always been assumed that the 1320 Declaration was written at Arbroath, but it is now also being questioned by experts whether or not the Declaration was actually signed at Arbroath on the 6th of April 1320, as has been assumed. Today, the USA and some Canadian provinces have officially adopted the 6th of April as Tartan Day in honor of Scotland and its beliefs in freedom and resistance to tyranny, concepts which largely have come down to us from the Declaration of Arbroath. The part of the document about King Robert the Bruce and the role of the king in relation to his people deserves to be quoted in full, and I quote, "Our king, we are bound to him for the maintaining of our freedom both by his rights and merits. Yet if he should give up what he has begun, seeking to make us and our kingdom subject to the King of England or the English, we would strive at once to drive him out as our enemy and a subverter of his own rights and ours, and we would make some other man who was able to defend us our king. For as long as 100 of us remain alive, we will never on any conditions be subjected to the lordship of the English, for we fight not for glory, nor riches, nor honors, but for freedom alone, which no good man gives up except with his life." Now people, this is an extraordinary claim. What this document says is what the Scots say, that if their king, Robert the Bruce, would not defend him for any reason, that they would replace him. Here the Scots are declaring, to put it plainly, if King Robert or his descendants ever sells out to the English, then he will simply be kicked off the Scottish throne and replaced. Wow. The implication behind this is that the sovereign only remains a sovereign by the will of the people, and not merely by divine right, a new and revolutionary idea at the time. Almost alone among the nations of feudal Europe, where the accepted concept was the authority flowed downward from the crown, Scotland stated clearly and firmly that here the rights flow upward from the people. In the presence of the king, they made it plain that he had their support as long as he did not betray them, and that, should he do so, they would choose another king. Later, in the American Declaration of Independence, We also find the concept of government by the consent of the government. In 1776, Thomas Jefferson wrote, and I quote, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. Wow. Who knew that what happened with the founding of America was actually rooted in Scotland years earlier? Robert the Bruce was certainly a courageous leader, and in the Declaration of Arbroath, the Scots compare him to the great hero of the Maccabees of Israel. From a rare 1850 book by William Livingston entitled Vindication of the Celtic Character, we read that, I quote, our prince and king, Robert, who in delivering his people out of the hands of their enemies as another Maccabee or Joshua, whom also by divine providence and the right of succession, according to our laws and customs, which we will maintain to the utmost, and with the due consent of all of us, have we made him our prince and our king. So this brings us to the strange case of the Tartan mummies of Takla, Makan. In the 1990s, the discovery of almost perfectly preserved 3,500-year-old mummies of an unknown extinct people in China's Takla Makan desert. These extraordinary mummies were scientifically proven to have had undeniably European roots. But it is the tartan or twill woven clothing that was found on the mummies that is of special interest here. Not only does this woolen plaid twill look like Scottish tartans, but it is also has the same weight, feel, and initial thickness as kilt cloth and has the Hallstatt materials. If the Bronze and Iron Age ancestors of the historic Celts wove woolen plaid twills so similar to modern ones, clearly the pre-nationalist Scots in the intervening centuries wove this sort of thing as well. The tartan plaid shown here from Clan MacGregor exemplifies a typical Scottish plaid. The oldest tartan in Scotland dates from about 325 AD, the early part of the 4th century. It was found near Falkirk and is now housed in the National Museum of Scotland. Not many tartans have survived in Scotland, mainly because cloth on the whole doesn't preserve too well in its climate and soil conditions, but the Takla Makan Desert is still one of the driest places on earth. Tartan cloth from much earlier times has survived there that is very similar, if not nearly identical, to the Scottish type of tartan, which has greatly intrigued archaeologists and other scientific experts today. So what is a stone of destiny, and how does it relate to the prophet Jeremiah? Well, we also find that the prophet Jeremiah and the Scots are linked by another powerful tradition, the legend of the La Fale, also known as the Stone of Destiny. This stone, said to be the coronation stone of the early Irish and Scottish kings, is also called Jacob's Pillar or Pillow. Scottish tradition says it originally came from Israel with a wandering people eventually reaching Ireland and then Scotland. In old accounts of this legend, the prophet Jeremiah brings this most holy relic of the people of Israel, Jacob's Pillow, to Ireland. The stone is very ancient and arguably the most powerful symbol of Scottish nationhood today. The story of this stone, so famous in Scottish legend and history, begins in the Old Testament, when the patriarch Jacob rests his head on a stone on his way to Haran. The account is in Genesis chapter 28, verses 10 through 22. And I'll quote the biblical passage here. Jacob set out from Beersheba and went on his way towards Haran. He came to a certain place and stopped there for the night because the sun had set, and taking one of the stones there, he made a pillow for his head and lay down to sleep. He dreamt that he saw a ladder which rested on the ground, which is with its top reaching to heaven, and angels of God were going up and down and upon it. The Lord was standing beside him and said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. This land on which you are lying I will give to you and your descendants. They shall be countless as the dust upon the earth, and you shall spread far and wide, to north and south, to east and west. All the families of the earth shall pray to be blessed as you and your descendants are blessed. Jacob rose early in the morning, took the stone on which he had laid his head, set it up as a sacred pillar, and poured oil on the top of it. He named the place Bethel. This symbol of a chosen people, a special stone of some type, forms much of the basis of the Irish and Scottish origin and kingship legends. Abraham's grandson Jacob has a dream while resting on the stone, in which God repeats the promise that his heirs will be the chosen of God. So let's jump ahead. In 722 BC, the Assyrians scattered all of the tribes of Israel except for Judah and Benjamin, and those so-called lost tribes then disappear from biblical history. In 586 BC, Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, was overthrown by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. The fall of Judah is said to have been a punishment by God for the disobedience of the people in not keeping his laws. The prophet Jeremiah and his scribe Baruch warned the king about the exile of the people, challenged the false prophets, and spoke of the promise of a restoration. Zedekiah did not heed the words of the prophet Jeremiah and was overthrown. Nebuchadnezzar killed all of Zedekiah's sons, leaving no male heirs of the royal line. Jerusalem and its temple were destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, and he carried off the holy treasures along with his captives into Babylon. The captives included Jeremiah, his scribe Baruch, and according to Scottish and Irish legends, also Zedekiah's daughter, who was the Princess T. Nebuchadnezzar freed Jeremiah, who promptly rescued several items from the temple. The tabernacle and the altar of incense are mentioned, and hid them in a cave near Pisgah. He also rescued Zedekiah's daughters, one of whom was the aforementioned Princess T. And with them he fled to Egypt. Jeremiah then completely disappears from biblical history, with no mention at all of where he went after being in Egypt. Tradition states that Irish kings were crowned at Tara on the Lay Fall, which is Jacob's pillow, for the next 1,000 years, until its departure to Scotland with King Fergus. The great dynasty was said to have been descended from Israel in those early accounts. Jacob's pillow, or the Stone of Destiny as it's called, has been shrouded in many myths and legends. It is mainly thought to be the coronation stone of the ancient kings of Israel and later of the Irish and Scottish kings. The stone that was returned to Scotland in 1996 from Westminster is a large piece of very old red sandstone, more than 400 million years old, and it is known to be similar to other rocks that have been found in the Scone area. The stone is roughly rectangular in shape and has iron rings at each end, as if it were once carried. The most unusual aspect of the stone, experts admit, is the obvious smoothness of its upper surface. Stone conservator Peter Hill has stated that this may be because people had once walked or knelt on it, implying that it may have been an object of veneration by pilgrims for many, many centuries. From its arrival in Scotland from Ireland, said to be around the year 500 AD, based on some legendary accounts, the stone has since been regarded as a most holy and mystical relic. When Edward I removed it, it was then later placed under the coronation chair in Westminster Abbey. Ever since, all the subsequent kings and queens of England and Great Britain have been crowned upon it. So when King Charles gets crowned later on this year, look for the stone underneath his coronation throne. The Stone of Destiny takes us back to Scone and the Celtic kings of Ionia, and to the first of Scotland's forefathers who landed at Argyll, and to the very roots of the Celtic race itself. It may be nonsense. It may be as legendary as the story of King Arthur, The Briton who, if he ever lived, fell fighting not for the English, but against them. What matters is what people believe, and Scots believe in the stone. However, to be sure, the stone that sits beside the Scottish regalia today is a most powerful symbol, an important emblem of Scottish nationhood and history. It is what it ultimately symbolizes that is really important, and the sheer number of traditions, myths, and legends about this stone also says something in and of itself. So how did the Scots get their independence that they love so much? Well, it happened at the Battle of Bannockburn, fought on June 23rd and 24th in the year 1314. It was a victory of the army of kings of Scots, Robert the Bruce. So how did the Scots get their freedom that they love so much? It happened at the Battle of Bannockburn, fought on June 23rd and 24th in the year 1314. And it was a victory of the army of King of Scots, Robert the Bruce, over the army of King Edward II of England in the First War of Scottish Independence. Although it did not bring an end to the war, as victory would be secured only 14 years later, Bannockburn is still a major landmark in Scottish history. King Edward II invaded Scotland after Bruce demanded in 1313 that all supporters still loyal to ousted Scottish King John Balliol acknowledge Bruce as their king or lose their lands. Stirling Castle, a Scots royal fortress occupied by the English, was under siege by the Scottish army. King Edward assembled a formidable force of soldiers to relieve it, the largest army ever to invade Scotland. The English summoned 25,000 infantry soldiers and 2,000 horse soldiers from England, Ireland, and Wales, against a paltry 6,000 Scottish soldiers that Bruce had divided into 3 different contingents. That's pretty bad odds. 25,000, actually it's 27,000 to 6,000. Not good. After Robert Bruce killed Sir Henry de Bohun on the first day of the battle, the English withdrew for the day. That night, Sir Alexander Seton, a Scottish noble serving in Edward's army, defected to the Scottish side and informed King Robert the Bruce of the English's camp's low morale, telling him they could win. Robert Bruce decided to launch a full-scale attack on the English forces the next day. The English army was defeated in a pitched battle, which resulted in the deaths of several prominent commanders. The Battle of Bannockburn has a twist. It turns out that on the second day, as the Scottish were assaulting the English positions, it looked like they were losing pretty badly. Things were not going well for Robert the Bruce. So he made a last-ditch effort by calling him in his reinforcements. And from his rear, in a copse of trees, 50 heavily armed knights riding horseback appeared and charged the English line. To the amazement of everyone there, the English to a man turned around and ran. Now what in the world could make the entire English army flee in front of 50, even though they were heavily armed knights? Well, rumor has it that flying at the front of this group of 50 knights was the Bosant battle emblem, the battle emblem of the Knights Templar, the Poor Knights of Christ, and the Temple of Solomon, the most feared warriors in all of the medieval world. The warrior monks of the Poor Knights of Christ and the Temple of Solomon were the most feared military organization for over 200 years in the Middle Ages. Their battle ensign, the flag, the Bosant, was a piebald black and white background with a red Maltese cross in the foreground. Rumor has it that when King Philippe of France arrested the Templars on Friday the 13th, and yes, that's why Friday the 13th is considered unlucky, because all of the Templars in medieval Europe were arrested on the same day. It is rumored that the very large Templar fleet, more than 20 ships, that was anchored at La Rochelle fled to Scotland, where they more or less disseminated into the local population. The day of the battle, 24 June, is St. John the Baptist Day. It was also known to be an important date to the medieval Knights Templar, leading to further speculation and various legendary accounts about a possible surviving Templar remnant at Bannockburn to assist Robert de Bruce, who is said to have been sympathetic to the plight of the Templars. Thank you for joining us on our jaunt through some Scottish and some religious histories. We hope you enjoyed this podcast. I look forward to seeing you again. Take care. This podcast was brought to you by the Dialogues in Philosophy and Religious channel on YouTube.